future relationship between the UK and ASEAN. Now, when I was asked by the Asia-Europe Institute to give this talk, I didn't exactly have it in mind to be sitting in my office at my desk giving the talk, but times have obviously changed and we all have to become more flexible and more virtual. And I'm sorry about that, because the part of these events I enjoy most is the Q&A that we get at the end, where I always get useful and insightful questions. But thank you to the AEI for sending me in advance some of the questions, which I'll try to answer as I'm going through this talk. So my brief is to talk about the UK's wider relationship with ASEAN and how that's evolving. I'm also going to throw in some wider reflections on the Asia-Pacific region, and of course I'll talk about the impact in the region of the UK's departure from the European Union. And I'm going to talk specifically about educational links in response to some of those questions that have come through the AEI. Now, that may all sound quite clear and logical and distinct questions, but of course these issues are very, very intertwined. On the question of the UK leaving the European Union, I think it's fair to say that there were a number of different sets of reasons why some people voted, or a majority of British people voted, that the UK should leave the European Union. Now, some people were worried that the UK was becoming too open and that immigration was a real problem. But others were worried that the EU was itself becoming too much of a constraint on the UK's freedom of action, and that the EU itself was becoming too inward-looking. Anyway, the current British government believes strongly that leaving the European Union is an opportunity to forge new trading relationships and to revive older relationships across the wider world, which have possibly been neglected while we've been an EU member state. Now, I think the Asia-Pacific region as a whole will see, and in fact already is seeing, an intensification of interest from the United Kingdom. Now, that flows from the strategic reality, which is a transition of power from west to east, which is one of the most important drivers of change in our generation. The Asia-Pacific share of the global economy will grow from some 35% in 2018 to 45% by 2030. And by 2030, 2/3 of the global middle class or consumer class will be in this region. And by 2050, Asia will represent more than a half of global GDP, which is a real rebalancing of the global centre of economic gravity back towards the east. On the UK relationship with ASEAN, one of the questions I had was whether ASEAN will become a priority partner for the United Kingdom. I believe it will, and in fact, I believe it already has become one. We value very highly our relationship with ASEAN, as well as our bilateral relationship with the 10 ASEAN member states. We became a dialogue partner with ASEAN over 40 years ago through our membership of the European Union, and we're one of the very few countries to have diplomatic representation in all 10 ASEAN countries. This was strengthened last November when we appointed our first ever ambassador to ASEAN. And he is supported, his name is John Lamb, he's now supported by a mission to ASEAN, which is working hard to broaden and strengthen and deepen the UK's relationship with ASEAN. I think it was very significant that when the UK government came to power, the first visit made by Foreign Minister Dominic Raab overseas was to attend the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Bangkok. And his first visit after the UK left the European Union at the beginning of this year was to the Asia-Pacific region, including to Malaysia. Over the past few months, we've been discussing the possibility of the UK submitting a formal bid to become an ASEAN dialogue partner in its own right, having left the European Union. And when Dominic Raab came here earlier this year, he discussed this with the then Prime Minister, Tun Mahathir, and with the Foreign Minister, Minister Saifuddin, and both were very encouraging of the UK's bid for dialogue partner status. I've discussed the matter with the new Foreign Minister, Mr. Hishamuddin, who is equally supportive, and I think that quite soon we're going to be in a position to put in our formal request for dialogue partner status. Now, we recognise that becoming a dialogue partner brings with it commitments as well as benefits, and we're ready to assume those responsibilities. In fact, the UK is already a major trade and investment partner with the ASEAN region, as well as a major development partner. I'll come back to trade issues in a minute, but just on the question of development, the UK already provides some £300 million a year in development assistance to this region. The majority of it, the lion's share, goes to Myanmar, of course, but we also have development programs in other ASEAN countries. We even have one here in Malaysia, what we call the Prosperity Fund, which is relatively small. It's £20 million over 5 years. But it's a really interesting project covering programs like future cities, like healthcare, like skills, and developing a low-carbon economy. I should also underline the importance of the security and defence relationship in this region. There are significant British forces in Brunei, and the UK, of course, is a member of the Five Powers Defence Arrangement, alongside Malaysia, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. And the UK is an active participant in the various military exercises under the auspices of the FPDA. In fact, one of my proudest moments here as High Commissioner in Malaysia was last year when RAF Typhoon fighter aircraft flew just over there past the Twin Towers, and they were here as part of an FPDA exercise, which I think shows our commitment to the FPDA. More widely, we've applied to become observers in the Specialist Peacekeeping and Military Medicine Working Group, and I hope that observer status will be agreed soon. Now, this focus on defence and security represents a recognition that this region is one which contains a number of potential flashpoints. And my last posting was as British Ambassador to South Korea, and I saw for myself the tensions on the Korean border. And of course, there are continuing tensions in the South China Sea. So let me take this opportunity to set out the British government view of that, which is that we oppose any activity which raises tensions or seeks to alter the facts on the ground in the South China Sea. We don't take any position on the various sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea, and we encourage all parties to settle their disputes peacefully through the existing legal mechanisms, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So let me move now to Brexit, the UK's departure from the European Union, and the trade and investment relationship with ASEAN. This is hugely important. The countries of ASEAN represent some £40 billion annually of trade, which is an increase of 3/4 over the previous decade, back to my point about the region becoming increasingly important as an economic powerhouse. And the UK has invested some £30 billion in this region. Now, the UK has traditionally been a champion of free trade, and that's more important than ever against a backdrop of growing global protectionism. And we've got a strong shared interest in ASEAN in maintaining an open and rules-based trading environment. And we jointly with ASEAN see considerable opportunities in new areas of trade, such as digital and e-commerce. We're a firm supporter of ASEAN economic integration and efforts to enhance connectivity in Southeast Asia through trade, investment and tourism. The UK is an active member of both the Asian Development Bank and the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Just a little bit about bilateral trade and investment matters. The UK and Malaysia have a very strong trade and investment relationship. The trade relationship is worth some £5 billion a year, and it's our second largest market in ASEAN. And we're particularly keen to promote sectors such as education, tech and services. And both sides are keen to promote this relationship. We've agreed that we're going to set up a bilateral working group on trade, which will look in detail at how we can strengthen two-way trade. One question that's been put to me is whether or not there'll be a closer trade and investment relationship between the UK and ASEAN after we leave the EU. My answer is that I believe and I trust that this will be the case. I've had many discussions with Malaysian investors over the past weeks and months about Malaysian investors in the UK, and they are not concerned about the UK's leaving the European Union. After all, they tell me, the reasons why they decided to invest in the UK have not changed. And when they talk about these reasons, they will usually talk about a stable legal environment with a strong rule of law. They'll talk about a common law system, which is very well understood here in Malaysia, of course. They'll talk about the English language and how that makes it easy for them to do business. And of course, as they say, the UK is in itself a large market. The UK is the world's 5th or 6th largest economy, depending on how the exchange rate is going. So that in itself is a large market for investors. Let me just briefly recapitulate where the UK is in the process of leaving the European Union. So we have formally left the EU, and we're now in a transition period which runs until the end of the year. And to all intents and purposes, what we have now is a situation where we're still in effect a member of the European Union through this transitional period, because the laws and rules and regulations of the EU still apply during this period. But my Prime Minister has been very clear that the transition period will end at the end of this year and will not be extended. So we're in a process now of what's a major task, of course, of negotiating our future trade and other arrangements with the EU. And we're engaged in negotiating our future trade arrangements with other countries such as the US and Japan. And the UK has, for the first time since 1973, taken its own seat at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. On the future relationship with the EU, we're asking to be treated as a sovereign equal, with a relationship similar to relationships the EU has with other third countries such as Canada. The EU has started from a slightly different place, with demands that we align our rules on fishing and on governance, where they're asking for a role for the European Court. The UK has now published a series of documents showing the outlines of the relationship that we wish to have with the EU, and we believe that is achievable by the end of this year. There have been other developments too. The UK has just published our own tariff table, or most favoured nation tariffs. These are the tariffs that will apply after the transition period ends and are an important building block of our independent trade policy. Now, I've had a couple of questions about education, so I should finish with that. The UK has for many years been exceptionally open to foreign students and teaching staff, and at present there are some 19,000 Malaysians studying in the UK. The UK government has made clear that Brexit is an opportunity to expand this, not reduce it. So one change will be that as of the end of the transition period, the end of this year, students from the EU will no longer have a favoured status in the UK that they presently have. And this will level the playing field between students coming from within the EU and outside the EU. One question I've had is if I expect that there will be preferences shown to Commonwealth countries as there were before the UK joined the European Union. That, I'm afraid, is a question that is yet to be decided. And there's many more answers that we will expect to get over the coming months. Now, COVID is going to make it increasingly complex for universities and other educational institutions. Some UK universities have already indicated that much of their teaching will be online for the next academic year. I can appreciate how frustrating this must be for many students, but the reasoning for doing it, I think, is clear, and we know now that the technology does work. But let's hope that after that, the universities will revert to old ways of doing things. In conclusion, I think that after Brexit is complete, the UK's links with both ASEAN and the countries of ASEAN will grow even stronger. I hope that ASEAN will decide to admit the UK as a dialogue partner, and that the UK will continue to strengthen trade and investment, as well as security links with the region. COVID is bringing great financial and economic stress to all of our countries. When the recovery comes, I think the UK will be well placed to benefit from it, and our trade and investment links with this region will be of great advantage to us all. And while the COVID crisis might bring about some changes in the way we think about globalization, I believe the UK will be just as outward looking and just as international after this crisis as it was before it. Thank you very much.